Hello, friends. I have missed you. I would like to welcome you to the show, Cultivate Your Mental Wealth. My name is Joyce Ozeh, and I am an attorney, a civil rights attorney in Chicago, for those of you who don't know. I am also a proud mental health advocate with lived experience, specifically with anxiety and depression. So, everything I'm talking about, everything I'm saying is real and comes from things that I actually practice in my own life. I want to talk about this space for those of you who are new to it. When I talk about cultivating your mental wealth, we aim to go from places of mental illness to places of mental abundance because wellness isn't just for us, it is also for our communities. And when we're able to live in the overflow, we're able to also give in the overflow. So that's where we talk about mental health as well. So again, I'm so happy to be back with y'all. It's been a little bit. Did you guys celebrate International Mental Health Awareness Day in October? I hope you did. I hope you saw the PSA. Thank you for everyone who shared that information and just raised awareness about resources and about wellness. I thought it was so beautiful. I also want to give you a little overview of today's show. So, as you know, we've been doing an entire series on mental wellness and boundaries. We've talked about boundaries with family, boundaries with friends, and boundaries with our colleagues or our supervisors in our places of employment. Let me know if you were able to tune into any one of those topics. I know that we've gotten so many comments, and it was so nice to interact with y'all as we talked about boundaries. And tonight is actually the series finale for mental wealth and mental health and boundaries. And we are specifically going to be talking about boundaries and our romantic partners. And before I talk about the guest that we have for today, I want to continue in the overview in that after our conversation, I'm going to make sure that you all are in tune and up to date with what's going to be coming with our November series. So stay tuned for that. And as always, I love to leave y'all with a practical push or two so that this isn't just a conversation that falls flat, but that you also have something tangible to take with you so that you can practice what it is we're preaching on this show for your own mental wellness. In the meantime, let me know where you're tuning in from. It's been so good to see y'all and to hear from y'all. So please let me know where you're tuning in from. And I also want to see from the audience, what are some of the real life challenges that you may have when it comes to setting boundaries? And it could be things that we've talked about before or boundaries with your romantic partners. Drop in the chat some of the challenges that you experience with either identifying boundaries or communicating those boundaries or enforcing those boundaries. I'd love to hear from you. If you can't drop it in the chat and if you're feeling kind of shy, feel free to email us at comethrive247@gmail.com. That is comethrive247@gmail.com. I am more than happy to process and navigate with you. And just as an aside, I recently was able to speak to someone, one of you listeners on the show, you emailed me and you were talking about boundaries in the place of employment. And there is actually an employment conference that's going on that one of our listeners emailed me about. And I sat with her for about an hour and we mapped out how to go about this conference, what to talk about, what resources to include. And I consulted with her for free. This is access that I'm only giving to my listeners, free consultation, free navigation, boundaries at work, boundaries with friends and family. Hit me up. I would love to hear from you. So that's our overview. I hope you're excited because I am really excited to wrap up this series in a really powerful way. But before we get to the main topic that we'll be talking about, I just want to set the room. So Here in this space, I may be talking to you or at you. I may also have a guest on the show, but I want you to know that so long as you are in this space, this is our conversation. This is our way to break stigmas when it comes to mental illness and talking about wellness. This is our way to break generational lies and strongholds that talk about you'll always have to be this way and you should be ashamed about things surrounding mental illness and mental wellness. You are safe here, you are seen here, and you are heard here. So enter the space freely, confidently, and knowing that you are safe. I'm so happy to have you with us. Shout out to Dawn, Dion, Patsy. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for joining. Let's get into it. Let's talk. Let's thrive. As I was saying, we will be talking about mental health boundaries and our romantic partners, how we set those boundaries, how we navigate them. And I have a very special guest with me today. I know y'all are going to be excited to see him. I always smile when I get to interact with him. It is the Ellis Dean. He is a speaker, a producer, a writer, and now a marketing manager at Common Spirit Health. He is also a BDO contributor. And I just want to say, welcome back. Welcome to the room.
Hello, hello.
Hi, I'm so glad to have you with us. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling orange.
A little Halloweeny. Oh yeah, for those who celebrate, I don't really celebrate Halloween, but a lot of candy. Take advantage freely. It's so good to see you.
It's so good to be seen. I mean, I do miss the BDO family. I it felt weird not having blackdoctor.org underneath my name, like with the label. But change is inevitable, as we talked about prior to the show, and it is what it is. So I'll be here from time to time, hosting, and still here around the family. But I love being on this side, of the guest spectrum.
No, I love it too. I think it's easier to kind of like be interviewed and talked, but you're not off the hook because this is going to be a conversation. So don't get too comfortable. And the only reason I could celebrate you becoming the marketing manager at Common Spirit Health was because I saw that you'd still be around. So I want to underscore, keep the lookout for Ellis Dean. He'll still be a contributor in this space, just in a different capacity. And that's fine. Change is beautiful. But okay, we are talking about boundaries and romantic partners. And I don't think I told you this, Ellis, but for our listeners, please listen to this. This actually originally wasn't a part of the Boundaries series. Only reason we're talking about this is because a listener actually messaged me saying, am I allowed to set boundaries with my husband?
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yes.
Right. And I said, oh, yes, ma'am. Like, we need to talk about boundaries and our romantic partners. That could be in marriage and courtship and dating and casual dating. But that was really the impetus for having this part of the series. So, again, a reminder for our listeners, if there's ever something you want to discuss, we will make it a whole show because we are really here for this to be a mutual conversation. So,
Yeah.
Ellis, I want to know, why do you think it's important, like just foundationally, to set boundaries in our romantic relationships, and whether there are any experiences that may have led you to realize the importance of setting boundaries in your romantic relationships?
But it's a family show, right?
The family, so now we're gonna get in trouble. So only say what has been approved.
Well, first I want to give a shout out to Dawn. Dawn, you're absolutely right. Mental illness can be a label, and so what we have to do is be very, very careful. So in my career before BDO, I was a mental health counselor. That's what my training is, and so you're absolutely right. You can be misdiagnosed, and then you can carry that label forward. You can carry that label if you're using your insurance to pay for it. You can carry that label along with your doctors and things like that. And so you have to be very careful. So, but please understand that initial diagnosis is not set in stone. It's not etched in
Mhm.
stone. You can get if it doesn't feel right to you, you can get a second opinion, right? And then particularly for people of color, we are traditionally misdiagnosed, and I can go through that's a whole other show. We're not going to talk about that, but we're here about boundaries and relationship. But Dawn, I just wanted to respect what you put in because you were open enough to share, and so I want to say yes. I see you're seen, you're heard, you're absolutely right. Get that second opinion. However, if that second opinion is corroborating but the first opinion is, then sometimes we do have to do some self-reflection and see what's really going on within ourselves. And so
Yeah.
you can help you define that, but please work with your counselor, your psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, whatever you're working with, to make sure that you're in agreement with what that diagnosis is.
And we're just going to flow in it too. I'm glad that you call that out. Thank you again for tuning in from England, Dawn. But along with it being a label and getting a second diagnosis, I'm glad that you were able to correct this with nutrition. And for those of you who may have gotten another diagnosis or a second opinion and it was still corroborating that first opinion, just because you were diagnosed doesn't mean that that label is who you are.
Yes.
So that is a sickness. It is something that you are experiencing, and it can sometimes be very real, but you don't have to identify fundamentally with any sickness or illness.
Yes.
There's a difference between treating it and it being a part of your identity. And that's also what we walk through on this show. So stay tuned for more of those type of conversations. But
Yes.
now steering us back to
Okay.
relationships and boundaries, because it's all intertwined, really. We're talking about why it's important. Labeling is important, how we navigate things. What are your thoughts with boundaries and relationships and why they're important?
I think they're very important, right? So first and foremost is boundaries and relationships are paramount to their survival. and I will say that the part of the reasons why my previous relationships before my current one did not last is because there was a lack of boundaries, right?
That's interesting.
Either internally, boundaries that I had on myself, boundaries that I had with my partner. I'm heterosexual, so my female partner. Um, boundaries that she had with me or didn't have with me. And so the lack of boundaries can be the demise of a relationship. And so the earlier you can establish them and agree to them, the better chance that relationship has for survival. And if it does end, don't make it end because of a lack of boundaries.
That is something that I don't hear often when we're talking about boundaries. I think boundaries get a bad rap to begin with. So I want to talk about like framing in a little bit, but I want to go back to what you said about why boundaries are so important. Because sometimes when people hear boundaries with their partners, they think, ooh, you're restricting our love, or this is going to be
Yes.
restrictive to my love. But what you experienced was the lack of boundaries is actually what was the demise of a previous relationship. And of course, no need to go into specifics, but just giving examples. How can a boundaryless romantic relationship actually negatively impact a couple? How can not having boundaries impact a couple? Because the common conversation is boundaries are going to restrict and choke a relationship.
Well, in a macro sense, I'll speak in a general sense, not specifically to anything that I have or haven't done, but I would say in a general sense, a lack of personal boundaries can lead to infidelity. Right. So if you don't have personal boundaries, and so there's two types of boundaries in relationships. There are your personal boundaries, your personal deal breakers, what you will or won't do in that relationship. And then there's relationship boundaries, right? What you will accept or won't accept as part of that relationship. So a lack of individual boundaries can lead to things like infidelity because you're saying, hey, I'm not okay, yeah, I'm in a relationship with them, but I like this person too, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And that means, hey, I don't have any boundaries on what is or what isn't, right? And so to having that definition and having those personal boundaries to say, hey, yes, while I might, you can't turn off attraction, right? So that's something, if somebody's attractive to you, whether it's physically, mentally, or whatever is attracting you to that person, you can't turn it off. What you can do is determine what you do with that attraction.
Yep.
And so that's the boundary level, right? So people feel like they feel guilty because they're attracted to somebody else. No, no. I personally, this is my personal opinion, you shouldn't be feel guilty because you feel that you're attracted to somebody else. But what you do with that is where the boundaries has to be set, and just be like, hey, look, for example, this past weekend, I went to my college's homecoming. I'm at a party. Young lady comes up to me. She starts asking me some questions, and then she asked me a question: "Are you married?" And I said, "Yes."
Very much so.
And she was attractive, and she was like, "Oh, wow," and she had this moment, and she walked away, and I was like, "Right, that could have been problematic, right? Because if I'd
Yeah.
have said no, she was willing to take that further, and that would have been a lack of boundaries on my part, not on hers, because she was single and fully single, but that would have been a lack of boundaries on my part, and so, and that would have been, and my spouse may or may she didn't have to know, but it's about how you respect yourself and the relationship, even when they're not around.
I appreciate that. That was something that I had to think very consciously of when I got married, is not just the boundaries that I communicate with my partner, but the boundaries that we communicate when our partners aren't around are also representative of our relationship, because
Mhm.
I don't ever want my behavior to dishonor my husband. Like, I don't ever want someone to look at me when I'm not with my husband and feel bad for my husband. You get what I mean? Like
Yes,
how you're moving makes him look goofy.
yes.
That is something, when I was thinking about boundaries and transitioning into marriage, is even when he's not around, I have to express my boundaries even when I'm not using words. But Belinda, I love what you said about how you set boundaries early on until you see a person's actions after a while. So this is like a nuanced version of boundaries too in a relationship, and
Hmm.
how boundaries can change and how they can evolve and how that is totally okay. So it kind of brings me into our next question with, how can a person determine what type of boundaries to set with their romantic partners, and how have you been able to do this? But one determination that I think Belinda has called out is time, how boundaries can change or be determined in the season. I know I set boundaries in courtship that don't exist now that we're married, but
Hmm.
what do you think, Ellis, about how a person can determine boundaries if they're trying to figure that out with a romantic partner? How do they know?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I think Belinda's doing it the right way, right? It's restrictions early, and then if they prove themselves to be trustworthy, then you can start releasing the boundaries. But it's harder to have no boundaries and then try to set them, because
Yeah.
it becomes expectations, right? And so, like, well, and people say, "Oh, you've changed. You've done this. You wasn't like this in the beginning." So I think Belinda is doing it the right way. Now, um, boundaries also require a couple of things in that formula. Like, we have recipes when we're cooking, whatever. So there's a recipe to be able to set good boundaries, and two of the essential ingredients are maturity, right? You have to be
Mm.
mature, and self awareness. And so those two ingredients are paramount to being able to set good boundaries in relationships, particularly romantic relationships, because you in that space, self-awareness allows for us to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? And that's another ingredient to have a good relationship, is that vulnerability, because that leads to greater and deeper connection. So I saw Dawn earlier talk about communication. That communication, yes, communication, but that's such a catch-all term, right? And so communication is it's a wide spectrum of communication. And so communication that is true, the truest to the core of who you are, that is the best type of communication. The communication that says, I'm willing to share something with you that could be used against me or hurt me if it's used in the wrong way. But I'm trusting you with this information. I'm trusting you with my innermost thoughts, my innermost feelings, that vulnerability. And the irony of relationships is this. Um, being that vulnerable brings you closer together and strengthens the relationship, right? But it's very scary. And so those boundaries are, sometimes we put boundaries up that are artificial, and those boundaries are really about around our feelings, our heart. We want to protect ourselves. And so we say superficially, I'm setting a boundary. No, no, no. You're setting a wall. And then you got to recognize the difference between the two of those two.
Period. That's actually what I wanted to step back off script and go away from.
Right.
You perfectly named it, Ellis. Let's talk about what boundaries are not. So you're talking about maturity and self-awareness are what
Mhm.
are necessary components in setting boundaries. Boundaries aren't a way to control your partner.
Right.
So people will say, well, my boundary is that you have to dress in a certain way, and that is just my boundary.
Right.
Mm, that's
A
not
rule. That's a rule. That's not a boundary. That's a
that's a
rule.
wound. It's control, that's not a boundary.
Right.
Now, if your boundary is I need a partner or I want to feel like my partner respects and appreciates me and respects and appreciates me, let's say the monogamy in this context of our relationship. And from that, you want them to behave a certain way, but your boundaries cannot be a way to covertly control someone. That's not a boundary. Also, let's look at boundaries as what we're keeping in as opposed to what we're keeping out, because that's the difference between the wall and a boundary that Ellis was talking about. So when we talk about boundary, we get real nervous because it's, oh my gosh, you're choking out my love. But really, when I'm setting a boundary in my marriage, when I was setting a boundary while I was dating, I'm keeping in peace of mind.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot function in chaos. I just can't.
Right.
So when I say one of the boundaries I actually set when I was dating my husband is look, ain't no ring on my finger, you're not going on my gram. Unless we are engaged, my boundary is in social media. I don't post boyfriends. I don't.
Mm.
Because I don't want to be accountable to the public if I break up or anything like that. And
Right.
that was the boundary that I had to communicate with him. Um, and he was the opposite. So he was posting me all the time and he got a lot of flack from his friends for that because it's like, oh, she's playing you, but and all of these lies. But that's a boundary that I expressed that wasn't a wall, but it was for my own peace of mind because I wanted to keep in peace. So boundaries aren't ways of controlling, and boundaries aren't so much about what you're keeping out and more of what you want to keep in. I want to keep peace. I want to keep trust. I want to keep safe vulnerability. I want to keep intimacy. And that is why we express boundaries with our romantic partners.
That's
Anything
a
else?
great question. So Don's on fire. So she's
Yeah.
asking a great question. I think defining boundary is a good way because we're right. We've said different things. We've talked about rules, right? Um, we've talked about control, and we've talked about boundaries. And so in defining boundaries, boundaries are something that's not. If your boundary has to include the other person, it's not a boundary.
Mm.
Right. And so it control is about the other person, right? Rules are about the other person, right? And so a boundary is, hey, here's what I'm going to accept for me and what I'm not going to accept for me. And so if you're saying, hey, I'm setting a boundary and it is dependent upon that other person, then it's not a boundary. It's a rule or it's a wall
Or it's a means, yeah, it's a means of control.
or it's control.
So your boundary can't be my partner must cook for me. That's not, you're just saying boundary and
It's not a boundary.
you're asking for compliance.
Your boundary has to be agnostic. It's a big fancy word that says I can transfer this boundary from this person to the next relationship to the next relationship, and it's not going to change. But if it changes from relationship to relationship, then it's not really a boundary; it's a rule because rules are flexible to are bent to the person that you're with. Boundaries should not be that flexible, right? Boundaries should be more ingrained to your core. And that's why I said maturity and self-awareness are really important in setting those boundaries because when we're younger and more immature, and this is where the mistakes that I made, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of relationships that ended because I was immature and I didn't set boundaries on myself. I didn't set those internal boundaries. So I was like, I just kind of do it, go in the moment. And so those type of things become problematic in a relationship. And you have to, when you're setting those boundaries for yourself, uh, empathy, compassion,
Mm.
all of those things those words that we say that are important really stand out when they're violated. And so you have to make sure that you're true to who you are at your core.
Yeah, they should reflect your core values. And it's okay if it changes in a different season, but
Right.
it shouldn't be so malleable that it changes situationally. Because
Oh,
then,
age. Oh, it's gonna change.
right, but it shouldn't, like you were saying, it shouldn't change so readily because it shows that you're either they weren't based on your core values or you don't know what your core values are. So identify your core values and from there set boundaries, not as a means to control, but as a means to keep in and to protect what you value. Ali, I love your question, and we're going to get to that about how to deal with partners who have breached our boundaries.
Hmm.
So we are definitely going to get to that. And Dion, love what you said. It was a warning to us all who may be new at boundary setting or those who are new at boundary setting. If you are new to setting boundaries, be prepared for a pushback or for those boundaries to be tested. So that kind of gets me into what I want to talk about before we get into what happens when your boundaries are violated or repeatedly violated. The pushback. How do we, who may be new to setting boundaries, how do we communicate those boundaries? Like, what if that's something that you struggle with? Maybe it might even help to talk briefly about why some people struggle with boundaries to figure out how then to overcome and communicate boundaries.
Well, I think in anything, particularly, I was speaking for the male species in a general sense. We're not taught to express our emotions or our feelings and have those conversations, right? And so we struggle in that, right? I still struggle in that, right?
Yeah.
And so the only emotions, particularly as Black men, and I'll even make it more specific, particularly as Black men, the only emotions that society allows us to express on a regular basis is joy, right? And so happiness.
Mhm.
Because even in anger, uh, there is a angry Black man kind of
Trope.
trope, narrative, whatever. And so, um, so if we haven't learned that skill from childhood on the conversely, girls are taught very, very early on, express your emotions. You're able to get into it, and
Mhm.
so and share it. So now you've got two people trying to come together. One has been taught their whole life to express their emotions. The other one has been taught their whole life to not do it. You can't even cry. You can't do anything, right? So it's like, and those two people are supposed to come together and form some sort of union, right? So that's almost counterintuitive off the rip. So it is a challenge.
Yeah.
Um, I think yes. So I think what we have to do is give people their context. So if you're, and what I mean by that is, and I've had to say this out loud as I've gotten older and more comfortable in this. I've had to say this to my spouse, is that if I say something about how I feel, don't attribute it to how you feel, because
Hmm.
that's discounting it. It dilutes what I'm doing, what I'm saying. And you could feel that way, but that's just not the space for
What's an example of that? So I am frustrated. This is just like,
that.
so I talk with my hands
Hmm. Oh, I do too. You see, I've been doing this the whole
all the
time.
time.
Yeah.
I'm Nigerian, born and raised here. My husband, born and raised in Nigeria. In Nigeria, the only time you see someone pointing is when you're yelling at a child.
Mm.
When we first got married and I was talking like this, he was like, that is so condescending. So, in that example, when he expresses to me, hey, please don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
If I then say, well, that makes me feel, is that what you're talking about with
No, when you go
countering?
right back, what you said, when you come back right and say, "Will you do it too?" and blah blah blah, like
Oh,
that, saying, "Okay, I might do it." I'm talking about when you do it, right? So this is what So it's because what you're saying is I'm not acknowledging what you just said to me, right? And you're saying unconsciously, and you might not be even meaning this, but what you're saying unconsciously, my feelings are more important than yours.
yeah.
And from a male perspective, give him the context of he probably had the courage. He had probably had to sum up the courage to even express something that's negative. That could be like, "Hey, look, this is how I'm feeling." That's a vulnerability, and then you violated it by making it about you.
Yeah.
And so, respect that moment that he's giving you in this space. And so, if you want to circle back around, make a mental note, write it down, put it on your phone, whatever, come back around to it when it's your time for your space, right? And I think in doing that, we can respect each other's boundaries, and that vulnerability on both sides can bring you closer together if you work through it. But it can also be a space when somebody's vulnerable. It can also be a space that is makes you go pull further apart, because if you violate it, they're going to be less likely to open up again.
Right. So, what I'm hearing and what I want to underscore that I think is so important when you're thinking about how to communicate boundaries with your romantic partner, also be prepared for how to receive the boundaries that they're communicating to you.
Yes.
Because in this conversation, I did not even think about how do we receive the boundaries from our partners. I was thinking
Mhm.
about communicating them, expressing them, protecting them. But if you're not in a place to also receive your romantic partner's boundaries, then you can't rightfully or productively expect for them to receive your own boundaries. And what I was talking about in my example was a communication boundary.
Mhm.
So my husband wasn't expressing this in an attempt to control my behavior. What he was actually expressing was a boundary in communication, in that for me to feel safe, for me
Mhm.
to feel respected, and for me to feel loved, I need to feel like my partner is communicating with me in a way that respects me and that makes me feel safe in the same way that I would give to you or I would give to her. So he chooses not to communicate with me in a way that makes me feel condescended. And his boundary is let that be mutual. And everything else that falls from it is this, this, and this. So that's how we can also learn to receive people's boundaries is, oh, this is not a behavior thing. This is a
Right.
communication boundary that he's expressing to me, and I need to be in a place to receive it. So,
A communication boundary that I had in all of my relationships was I never call anyone out of their name. Right. Okay.
yeah,
It had nothing to do with, and I know all the societal things, and that had something to do with me. I was like, I'm not going to do it. And because my thought has been and always will be, arguments happen in relationships, right? They happen, get over it. You can forget what you argued about, but you're
yeah,
never going to forget if I say,
yeah,
calling you out your name and doing all of this and that in the argument. And you can say, yeah, I was mad and all this other stuff. But you know what you're saying because it comes out of your mouth. You have control over what you say. And so you forget the argument, but you won't forget that I called you a B word or whatever.
hmm,
You'll never forget that.
yeah,
You'll never forget if I put my hands on you. So that's what I'm talking about, the difference in boundaries versus rules and walls and all these other terms. That's a boundary that I've set that could be transferred from one relationship to the next to the next. Is that this is the type of person I'm going to be because that's how I want to be. So that is a boundary that I've set. But I communicate that openly with my partners. And I said, I would like that same respect from you.
Yeah.
And so we can argue, cool, I get it. It happens. If your relationship is perfect, yeah, y'all never had an argument, that means y'all not being honest with each other. Right? In my opinion. It's all my opinion. You've never had an argument, like, okay, y'all not really been honest because
Yeah.
they have done something that's been annoying. You just haven't said it out loud. So, but in that mutual understanding, that every partner that I've had that I've communicated that to says what they're hearing from me is your safety is more important. Your mental health safety, your physical safety is more important than any way I feel about whatever's happening in that moment.
Hmm.
And so that is a deeper communication that can't be that can be done in the gifts and all that other stuff. But what you're saying is you're going to be safe with me. I'm never going to put you in a situation where you feel like you're unsafe, even in an argument.
Mm-hmm.
So that changes how the interaction goes, and you can have some real conversations.
Some real conversations and some real intimacy. So we've talked a lot about like communication boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
If you're wondering what other boundaries there can be financial boundaries. There are things that I am just not willing to spend a lot of money on, and I had to communicate that, or vice versa. There are things that I really want to invest in. We had to communicate that. There could be personal space and time boundaries. Shout out to all my introverts. I've had to tell my my roommates and my husband, if I come home, I say hi to you and I go to the room, you didn't do nothing wrong. I just need some personal time and personal space to recharge. And that's a boundary that has been consistent with me my whole life. And again, it's not that I'm keeping you out. What I'm keeping in is energy. And I just need to up my energy. And I'll be good in like 20, 30 minutes. Just let me go to the room, personal space and time. Physical boundaries. It's
Mm-hmm.
okay that you are in a romantic relationship and you say no to intimacy. It's okay that you're married and you say no to intimacy. You're not being ungrateful or wrong or stingy. What I would caution you hardly against is withholding physical intimacy in marriage as a way to be punitive or
Mm-hmm.
to like weaponize intimacy.
Right.
Again, that is not a boundary, that is a wall, and that is actually very, very manipulative.
Right.
And it's okay if you just aren't feeling like it, or you're tired, or you just don't want to. Physical boundaries with your romantic partner are necessary. And again, safety is what's important, and it's okay to express that. So, communication, financial, physical boundaries, privacy boundaries. I happen to be in a relationship where he knows my passwords and I know his, but I would feel kind of weird if he just grabbed my phone like when I wasn't looking and started going through it as if to look for something, as if to imply. So I don't know if there are other boundaries that you can think of, Ellis, for romantic partners while we're wrapping up.
No, you hit the head on it. So, I would just say, as a cautionary tale, the number one reason why couples get divorced is financial. So those financial boundaries and conversations need to be had. One might be a saver, one might be a spender, and those two, you might not learn that until you get deep into this relationship, and then that becomes problematic, right? And so, because if the saver is trying to build for the future, and the spender is out there buying some Gucci shoes, so you've got to make sure you have some middle ground on that. And that doesn't mean that you have to go swing one way. The saver becomes a spender or the spender becomes a saver. What that does say is, okay, how do we find a space of compromise where both are satisfied in a way? And so and compromise means you're going to have to give up a little bit. So if you're a spender, you can't spend as much. Like you got to find this space where you can scratch that itch without bringing the bank account down to below an acceptable level. The saver, you can't be stealing ketchup packets from McDonald's because you know what I'm saying, because you don't want to buy ketchup, right? Because you be like, hey,
Can't do that. No.
it's free at McDonald's, but hey, why I got to buy a bottle of ketchup? If you pin it so hard where Abraham Lincoln's got to say, ouch, that's a that's a other that's a other piece, right? So compromise means you got to find some common ground, and even to the point where I know couples that are very comfortable in having separate bank accounts, right? And so and 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 they pay the bills, and hey, here's my contribution, here's your and they do it that way. Now, is it because of control? Right. That's where you can venture into control, where you make more money, you don't want that person in that space, and so that can where it can get problematic. So what the financial boundaries are really really important. It does require those two things: maturity and self awareness. Right. Uh,
Question why? Why is this boundary here? Why is this really here? Is
yes,
it because I'm afraid? Is it control? That's different versus what am I keeping in? What am I cultivating within these boundaries?
absolutely.
You want to stretch a little bit because I love what Ali said. You've identified the boundaries, you've
Mhm.
communicated the boundaries, and the boundaries get broken. And I want to make a distinction between a pattern and practice of breaking boundaries and um like a boundary being broken. Like my husband communicated his communication boundaries, and I slipped up multiple times before I really remembered, okay, Joyce, pointing means something different back home than it does here.
Hmm.
That is an innocent, on my part at least, mistake. So, one, remembering that these boundaries are maybe new for you and for the other person, and it's something that they're going to have to grow in. But there are some hardcore deal breaker boundaries like don't ever physically assault me,
Hmm.
cheat on me, and maybe these people violate those boundaries. What do you do when you're seeing a pattern and practice of a violation of boundaries? And one, I know we can't answer this categorically because it depends on the severity, but how do you then move forward when your boundaries are repeatedly violated? Do you reconcile? Does it depend?
I think it's more situational, but I think if you're okay with somebody repeatedly violating your boundaries, that says a lot about you and what you're willing to accept. And so there could be some self-esteem issues, and I saw that in one of the comments in terms of self-esteem. People that have a lower self-esteem in general are willing to accept less from everyone, from their friends, family, coworkers, partners, whatever. So that's a general thing, and so um, building up of self esteem is important. People that are users tend to seek out those that have lower self esteem, and so they're seeking somebody that they can continue to use, and so. And the person with lower self esteem says, "Oh, I deserve to be abused or used," and so they seek out there. And so that's why you say, because all the time you see people in these abusive relationships, but why does she keep going back? It's like, well, that's a self esteem issue. It's not the fact that she's so connected to this person, and I'm saying she in a general sense, but that person, they're so attracted to them. It's just like they're attracted to that because they see that's what they feel like they deserve internally, and so they've got to work through that. I know we're pushing up on our time, but the last thing I will say is that self awareness piece. You have to know who you are, and the earlier we can determine that, the earlier you can identify that, the better off you're able to not only recognize what is a boundary versus a rule versus control versus something else. You have some discernment in that. You're also more willing to articulate it and say it out loud to somebody, and I'm realizing this, in another capacity, in a professional sense. When I was young in my working life, I was didn't say anything, okay, and I would go home, oh, now I'm like, hey, it is what it is. I'm very, very comfortable with who I am,
Yeah.
what I bring to the table,
Mhm.
what is and what isn't, right? Now there's a humility in that. And I'm like, hey, I'm always willing to work, but
Mhm.
my voice is going to be heard. Doesn't mean it's the only voice. I want everybody to contribute, but I'm not going to sit there and be silent. If I have a strong opinion, I'm going to say it. I'm not going to say it to be offensive, but I want my voice to be heard. And so that's the space where we have to find out. And so if you don't take anything away from this, I always like walk takeaways. I know you don't take anything away from this. Maturity, self-awareness. Find it. If you're having struggles with that, email the show, get a counselor, work through that. And then I would say if you're in a relationship and you're working through self-esteem issues, when you get to that point, a good counselor is going to have you bring that partner in, because you're going to change if you're going through therapy, if you're going through counseling for an issue that you came with. You're going to change, and you need to bring your partner in there so they can make that change with you, because that could be friction, because you're like, hey, I'm this new person, I got this newer self-esteem, and your partner will be like, wait, you've changed, and that could become problematic. So I would say include your partner as you're going through that process.
100%. I love what you said about self-awareness. Ellie, you're talking about how it's optimal, because it is. When we're analyzing what to do when a boundary has been breached, the most important question is, what was that boundary?
Mm-hmm.
Because not everything is fatal. It's a boundary and it's important. But again, my husband isn't going to leave me because I keep doing this. But we have, thank God, but we have other boundaries like infidelity, which for us personally are deal breakers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think infidelity always has to be a deal breaker, but only you are able to determine that for yourself. I know couples who have worked through the repeated breaching of that boundary and are married and are healthy and have healed and have been held accountable. So first determine what that boundary means for you. Then determine take self-awareness. Then listen to what your partner is saying.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry once a boundary is broken isn't enough. What are they committed to do beyond the I'm sorry?
Mm-hmm.
Changed behavior is necessary for you to feel safe and for you to feel honored as you rightfully deserve. And that changed behavior needs to be proved over time. So self-awareness, what is that boundary? What is your partner saying about that breach? How are they talking about it? Because sorry isn't enough. And sorry won't keep you safe, right? Emotionally and or physically. And also, what are you bringing to the table? Never forget it, like what Ellis was saying. You bring so much to the table, and you need to be confident enough to know that I deserve to be honored, and I deserve to have my values and my boundaries honored and respected. That is very important. And also, don't guilt or shame yourself if you've repeatedly allowed boundaries to be trespassed and broken. I mean, that was me for years. We're going to have another series conversation about mental health and dating and mental health and singleness and how we navigate that. But there's nothing wrong with you for staying in a relationship where boundaries have been repeated. There does have to come a time, though, where you wake up and you recognize how glorious and how worthy you are, despite who you were yesterday. Because what we say here is you don't have to be who you've always been. So I hope that helps. I know that there's so much more to
Find your no, whether it's internal or external. Find your no.
Find your no. For those of you who still have questions, again, you can email me at comethrive247@gmail.com. That's comethrive247@gmail.com. We want you to be thriving 24/7, even when it's difficult. And I'm happy to navigate and process with you further. This entire show came about because someone reached out to me and talked about this. So that could be you. Before we go to what's happening next week and some practical pushes, I want us to give a virtual round of applause for our guest co-star, our guest host, Mr. Ellis Dean. It is always a pleasure. It is always such a vibe with you.
Thank you so much. I was like, I know we probably didn't get to all the points, but I think there were some great comments coming in from the viewers, and so I appreciate, particularly Dawn is getting it. Like she's on fire. Yeah, I appreciate that, and I want to make sure that we're respecting and honoring, because that's what this show has been about. Whether I was producing it or now as a guest, This show has always been about the viewer, and so I wanted to honor that part of your show. And so thank you all for being so active, Dawn and Allie, and there was a few
Dion.
and whatnot. So I wanted, but also this is complicated, and so again, if we could solve it in one show, we would be the best show ever. It's complicated, but be true to yourself, be true, and you know what it is.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk about what you can stay tuned for. Next week, I'm actually going to be back for our new series on mental health and the church. It's a two-part series. I'm going to have an expert with us to talk about the dark history with how mental health has been treated, specifically in the Black community, specifically as it relates to the Big C church. So stay tuned for that next week. I believe it's going to be November 7th. Same time, same place. Come with your questions. I'm so happy to be here with y'all. I'm going to move into now one of my favorite segments of the show, and that is practical pushes to leave you with as we part ways for now. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, friends. I call you friends because we get real in this space, and I appreciate everything that you all have shared. I cannot leave you without giving you some practical pushes to really practice what we've preached in this space. First, I want you to rethink boundaries. Don't worry about what you're keeping out or people pleasing. Think about what you're keeping in when you set boundaries that align with your values. You're keeping in peace of mind, healthy communication, and the ability to love intimately and safely when you set boundaries. So rethink boundaries as what you're keeping in versus what you're keeping out. I also want you to practice identifying your boundaries. Your boundaries should be based on your values. If you value integrity and loyalty, your boundaries around infidelity with your romantic partner are going to look in a certain way. If you value space and time, that's going to be your boundary. If you value physical safety, sexual safety, you're going to learn how to have boundaries around those things. So identify the things that you value and how you want to feel in a productive and safe relationship. And that is how you can establish those boundaries. Also, lastly, communicate clearly. Our partners may love us, they may be well intentioned, they are not mind readers. Don't be afraid to communicate clearly and assertively what you need and the boundaries that you have. You are worthy of the things that you demand that honor yourself. You are worthy of love that is safe, that is whole, that is joyful, and that comes with peace. Reject this narrative of struggle love. With boundaries, there may be some challenges that you navigate, but the overarching narrative of your love life as Black people should not be struggle. Practice, practice, practice makes perfect. It's okay if it's awkward, it's okay if you stumble, but practice identifying and communicating boundaries. And I promise you, you will get to a place where you yourself, regardless of who you're with, are able to thrive. With that being said, go thrive. Thank you, friends.